Grace Keller clutched her worn leather-bound journal as a wave of laughter erupted from the saloon porch, cutting through the dusty air of Willow Creek like a knife. It was 1878, and the mining town nestled in the Colorado Rockies had been her home for exactly 3 days, long enough for everyone to discover she didn't speak, but not nearly long enough for them to stop finding amusement in it. "Look, boys," the mute girl's out for her daily stroll. Walter Simmons, the local blacksmith's son, called out to his companions, who promptly joined in with their own taunts. Grace kept her eyes fixed on the dirt road ahead, her chestnut hair pinned tightly beneath a modest bonnet, shoulders squared despite the shame burning her cheeks. She'd come west following her uncle's death, her only living relative, with nothing but a small inheritance and the hope of starting fresh. The stage had dropped her in Willow Creek, and the boarding house run by Mrs. Phillips had seemed as good a place as any to gather herself. She hadn't spoken a word since the fever took her parents 5 years ago. The doctor in Boston had called it hysterical mutism. But Grace knew it wasn't hysteria that sealed her lips, it was a grief so profound it had stolen her voice like a thief in the night. Grace quickened her pace past the jeering men, clutching her journal tighter. Inside those pages were all the words she couldn't speak, the only place she felt truly heard. "Hey," Walter called, stepping off the porch. "I'm talking to you, girl." Grace's heart hammered against her ribs, but before Walter could reach her, the sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled everyone's attention down the main street. A tall man on a chestnut stallion rode into town, dust swirling around horse and rider. His broad shoulders were draped in a weathered duster, a worn Stetson pulled low over his eyes. Grace paused despite herself, watching as the stranger dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. "Bartlett?" Sheriff Mills called out, stepping from his office. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "Trail led nowhere," the man replied, his voice deep and steady as he secured his horse to the hitching post. Grace tried to move on unnoticed, but Walter had other ideas. "Hey, Mute Mary, don't you know it's rude not to greet newcomers?" Walter stepped directly into her path, forcing Grace to stop short. The stranger Bartlett turned at the commotion, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. Walter grinned. "Just teaching the town's newest oddity some manners." Girl don't speak a word, just walks around scribbling in that book of hers. Grace felt her cheeks burn hotter as the stranger's gaze fell on her. She clutched her journal protectively to her chest, eyes downcast. "That right?" Bartlett said, stepping closer. "And how exactly does harassing a lady qualify as teaching manners?" Walter's smile faltered. "Now, Buck, we're just having a bit of fun, seems to me," Bartlett said, removing his gloves one finger at a time, that a man who'd find amusement in another's suffering might be lacking some fundamental lessons himself. Walter hesitated, then scoffed. "She ain't suffering, she's just peculiar." Grace wished the ground would swallow her whole, but remained rooted to the spot, unable to flee without pushing past either Walter or the cowboy. Bartlett moved with surprising speed for a man of his size, closing the distance between himself and Walter. "The lady's silence doesn't make her peculiar. Your lack of decency, however, makes you a nuisance." He turned to Grace then, and she was struck by the intensity of his blue eyes, clear as mountain water. "Madam," he said with a slight tip of his hat, "don't mind these fools. Your silence speaks volumes about their character, not yours." Grace felt something shift inside her, not her voice returning, but a warmth spreading through her chest. She managed a small nod of thanks, her eyes meeting his briefly before darting away. "Buck Yates," he introduced himself, standing between her and Walter like a human shield. "Town's tracking some cattle rustlers, just got back." Grace opened her journal and quickly wrote her name, turning it for him to see. "Grace Keller," he read aloud, then smiled. "Fitting name." Walter and his friends, seeing their entertainment spoiled, drifted back to the saloon with muttered curses. Sheriff Mills called Buck over to discuss something, and with another tip of his hat to Grace, the cowboy excused himself. Grace hurried back to the boarding house, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The following morning, Grace ventured to the general store, list in hand from Mrs. Phillips. The bell above the door announced her entrance, and Mr. Howard, the proprietor, gave her a curt nod. "Miss Keller," he acknowledged. "What can I help you with today?" Grace handed him the list, and he squinted at the items. "Flour, sugar, coffee. Give me a moment to gather these." As Mr. Howard moved around the store, the bell jingled again. Grace turned to see Buck Yates ducking his head to enter, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Morning," he greeted Mr. Howard, then spotted Grace. "Miss Keller." She nodded in greeting, surprised he remembered her name. "What brings you to town?" Mr. Howard asked. Grace watched as Buck leaned against the counter. "Passing through originally. Sheriff asked me to stay on, help with these rustlers. They've hit 3 ranches in the county." "Bad business," Mr. Howard agreed. "Stole half of Peterson's herd last month." While they talked, Grace gathered her courage and scribbled a note in her journal. When there was a lull in the conversation, she slid it toward Buck. "Thank you for yesterday," he read aloud, then smiled. "No need for thanks, Miss Keller. Some folks need reminding of their manners." Grace wrote again. "How long will you stay in Willow Creek?" Buck considered the question. "Hard to say. Until we catch these rustlers, I suppose. Sheriff's deputized me temporarily." Mr. Howard returned with Grace's items. "That'll be 85 cents, Miss Keller." Grace counted out the coins and placed them on the counter. "Let me help you with those," Buck offered, gesturing to the packages. Grace hesitated, then wrote, "I couldn't impose." "It's no imposition," Buck insisted. "I'm headed that direction anyway." Outside, Buck carried the parcels as they walked toward the boarding house. "Mrs. Phillips runs a tight ship," he commented. "Been taking my meals there. Food's good." Grace nodded, then paused to write. "Where are you from?" "Texas originally," Buck replied. "Been wandering the territory since the war. Never found a reason to stay anywhere for long." Grace pointed to herself and wrote, "Boston." Buck whistled low. "That's a fair journey. What brought you all this way?" She hesitated before writing, "A new beginning." Something in Buck's expression softened. "I understand that better than most." At the boarding house steps, Buck handed over her packages. "Miss Keller, I wonder if you might join me for dinner tonight. Mrs. Phillips sets a nice table and company would be welcome." Grace's pulse quickened. She hesitated, then wrote, "People will stare." "Let them," Buck said simply. "I've never much cared what others think." With trembling fingers, Grace wrote, "Yes, thank you." That evening, Grace changed into her best dress, a simple blue cotton with white trim. She'd unpinned her hair, allowing it to fall in waves past her shoulders, secured with a modest ribbon. When she descended the stairs, Buck was waiting in the parlor, speaking with Mrs. Phillips. He'd cleaned up, his usually wind-blown hair combed neatly, his shirt fresh. "Miss Keller," he said, a smile touching his lips. "You look lovely," Mrs. Phillips beamed. "Doesn't she, though? Come along, dinner's nearly ready." The dining room held 3 other boarders, a traveling salesman, an elderly widow, and a young man working for the mining company. All eyes turned to Grace as she entered with Buck, and she felt her resolve wavering. Buck must have sensed her discomfort, because he guided her to a seat and promptly engaged the table in conversation about the weather and local news, drawing attention away from her. Throughout dinner, whenever Grace needed something, Buck seemed to anticipate it passing the salt before she reached, refilling her water glass, offering bread just as she looked for it. He included her in conversations with small questions she could answer with a nod or shake of her head, never making her feel lacking. After dinner, Buck suggested a short walk. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I hope dinner wasn't too uncomfortable," Buck said as they strolled. Grace shook her head and wrote, "It was nice. Thank you for making it easier." "May I ask how long it's been since you've spoken?" Buck inquired gently. Grace hesitated, then wrote, 5 years since my parents died." Buck nodded slowly. "I'm sorry for your loss. I lost my parents young too, father in the war, mother to consumption after." They walked in companionable silence for a while before Grace wrote, "People think I'm broken. Are you?" Buck asked, not unkindly. Grace considered this, then wrote, "Maybe, but not in the way they think." "We're all broken in some way, Miss Keller," Buck said, looking up at the stars. "Some scars are just more visible than others." Over the next 2 weeks, Buck became a regular fixture in Grace's life. He would often accompany her on errands, sharing stories of his travels while she responded through written notes. Grace found herself looking forward to their encounters, her heart quickening whenever she caught sight of him. The townspeople's attitude began to shift, too. With Buck's obvious respect for Grace, others started treating her with more consideration. Mrs. Phillips remarked that she'd never seen Grace so animated, even without words. One afternoon, Buck invited Grace to ride with him to a nearby meadow. "There's something I want to show you," he explained, "if you're willing." Grace agreed, and Buck helped her mount a gentle mare from the livery stable. They rode for nearly an hour, following a stream that eventually opened into a stunning meadow filled with wildflowers, mountains rising majestically in the background. "Found this place tracking those rustlers," Buck explained as they dismounted. "Thought you might appreciate it." Grace took out her journal, writing, "It's beautiful, thank you for sharing it." Buck spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat enjoying a simple picnic of bread, cheese, and apples he'd packed. "Sheriff thinks we're close to finding the rustlers' hideout," Buck mentioned. "Might be able to catch them within the week," Grace wrote. "Will you leave then?" Buck studied her handwriting for a moment. "I hadn't given it much thought. I suppose I should be moving on." Grace nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Unless," Buck added carefully, "I had a reason to stay." Grace looked up at him, her heart racing. She wrote, "What kind of reason?" "A compelling one," Buck replied, his voice softer than usual. "Someone worth building a future with." Grace felt her cheeks warm as she wrote, "Is there such a person in Willow Creek?" Buck's gaze met hers directly. "I believe there is. A woman of remarkable strength and grace who communicates more honestly without words than most manage with 1,000. Grace's hand trembled as she wrote, "I'm not whole." "None of us are," Buck replied. "But 2 broken pieces sometimes fit together better than whole ones ever could." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently covering her hand. "I don't need to hear your voice to understand your heart, Grace." A tear slipped down her cheek as she wrote, "I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently, of hoping, of trusting, of losing again. Buck nodded in understanding. "Fear's a natural traveling companion in this life, Grace, but it makes for a poor guide." He reached out, carefully brushing away her tear. "I'm not asking for promises, just a chance to see where this trail might lead us." Grace looked at him, this man who had defended her, respected her silence, and seen her when others looked past. Slowly, she nodded. Buck's smile was as warm as the afternoon sun. "That's enough for now." The next day, Buck rode out with Sheriff Mills and 2 other men, following a fresh lead on the rustlers. Grace spent the day anxiously waiting for news, unable to concentrate on her mending or reading. It was well after dark when they returned. Grace heard the commotion from her room and rushed to the window to see Buck dismounting, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. She hurried downstairs, grabbing her journal as she went. In the parlor, Mrs. Phillips was already fussing over Buck while the sheriff recounted their confrontation with the rustlers. "Got the whole gang," Sheriff Mills was saying. 5 of them holed up in that abandoned mining camp near Devil's Ridge. Buck here took a bullet grazing his arm when they opened fire, but he still managed to bring down their leader. Buck looked up when Grace entered, his tired face brightening. "It's just a scratch," he assured her before she could write her concern. Doc already looked at it. Grace wrote quickly, "You could have been killed." "Occupational hazard," Buck replied with a weary smile, "but we won't be troubled by those rustlers again." After the sheriff left and Mrs. Phillips retreated to the kitchen for tea, Grace sat beside Buck on the sofa. She wrote, "I was worried." "Were you now?" Buck asked, his eyes warm despite his exhaustion. Grace nodded, then wrote, "Does this mean you'll be leaving soon?" Buck shook his head. "Actually, Sheriff offered me a permanent deputy position. Seems Willow Creek could use an extra lawman." Hope bloomed in Grace's chest as she wrote, "And will you accept?" "I'm considering it," Buck replied. "There's a small house available on the edge of town, nothing fancy, but it could be a good place to put down roots." Grace bit her lip, then wrote boldly, "I would like it if you stayed." Buck's expression softened. "That's the most compelling argument I've heard yet." Over the next month, Buck settled into his new role as deputy. He purchased the small house he'd mentioned, spending his free time making repairs and improvements. Grace often joined him, bringing lunch or helping with simple tasks. The town grew accustomed to seeing them together, the quiet woman and the steady lawman. Gradually, the mockery Grace had faced upon arrival faded into acceptance, then respect. Buck courted her properly, with Mrs. Phillips' approval. They took walks in the evenings, attended church services together on Sundays, and shared meals regularly. Buck never pressured Grace to speak, accepting her written communications as naturally as if they were spoken words. One evening in late summer, Buck invited Grace to his newly finished home for dinner. He'd prepared a simple meal himself, the table set with wildflowers from the meadow he'd shown her. "It's not much," Buck said as he showed her around the modest two-bedroom house, "but it's mine. First place I've ever owned outright." Grace wrote in her journal, "It's wonderful. You've done beautiful work." After dinner, they sat on the small front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Buck seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous. Finally, he turned to Grace. "I had a whole speech planned," he admitted, "but I find myself at a loss for words, which is ironic given the circumstances." Grace tilted her head questioningly. Buck took a deep breath. "Grace, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, your strength, your kindness, the way you see the world and share it through your writing." Grace's heart pounded as Buck reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring with a modest pearl set between two tiny emeralds. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it all these years, waiting for the right person." Grace's eyes filled with tears as Buck continued. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Grace. I promise to respect your silence for as long as it lasts, and to listen for your voice in all the ways that matter." Grace's hands trembled as she reached for her journal, but instead of writing, she closed her eyes, gathering every ounce of courage she possessed. Her lips parted, and a sound small and rusty from disuse emerged. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible but unmistakable. Buck's eyes widened in shock, then filled with emotion. "Grace," he breathed, taking her hands in his. "Yes," she repeated, the word slightly stronger. Her voice was hoarse, uncertain, like a creek thawing after winter, but it was hers. Buck's smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. "I'd have been happy with a nod," he said, his own voice thick with emotion. Grace touched his face gently. "You gave me raisin," she managed, the words halting but determined. Buck pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Take your time," he murmured against her hair. "We have the rest of our lives." They were married that October in a small ceremony at the local church. Grace managed only her vows aloud, "I do," spoken clearly enough for all to hear. But it was enough to bring tears to Mrs. Phillips' eyes and astonished smiles to the faces of the townspeople. Buck built a life with Grace in Willow Creek. He continued as deputy, eventually becoming sheriff when Mills retired. Grace found purpose teaching reading and writing to the town's children, her voice gradually returning, never quite as it had been before, but strong enough to read stories aloud to her students and later, to her own children. In the spring of 1880, their first daughter was born, followed by a son 2 years later. Buck built an extension onto their little house, adding a proper parlor and another bedroom. Grace kept her journal through the years, recording their life together, the joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. Sometimes, when words still failed her in moments of strong emotion, she would write instead of speak, and Buck would read her thoughts aloud, bridging the gap between silence and sound. On their 10th anniversary, Buck took Grace back to the meadow where he'd first hinted at a future together. Their children played among the wildflowers while they sat on the same blanket, now well worn from family picnics. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked, her voice soft but clear. "Staying in Willow Creek, marrying a woman who couldn't speak." Buck took her hand, running his thumb over the wedding band that had joined her mother's ring. "Not for a single moment," he replied. "Your silence taught me to listen in ways I never had before, and what I heard was beautiful." Grace leaned against his shoulder, watching their children chase butterflies through the tall grass. "I was so afraid when I came here," she confessed. "Afraid I'd never belong anywhere again." "And now?" Buck asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Grace smiled, the years of pain and isolation faded like old photographs. "Now I know that home isn't a place. It's where you're understood, even in silence." Their daughter called to them, holding up a perfect wildflower for their inspection. Buck and Grace rose together, hands intertwined, walking toward their children and the future they'd built word by precious word. In the years that followed, Grace became known throughout the county for her quiet wisdom and unfailing compassion. The woman who had once been mocked for her silence became someone people sought out when they needed counsel or comfort. Buck, never tired of introducing her proudly as "my wife, Grace," his eyes still holding the same wonder they had the first time she'd spoken his name. And though her voice returned fully with time, Grace never forgot the value of silence or the cowboy who had understood its eloquence when no one else could hear.